You to join us to the conference hall, please. ალბათონებო და ბატონებო, კიდევ ერთხელ უმორჩილესად გთხოვთ დაიკავოთ თქვენი კუთვნილი ადგილები. დროის რეგლამენტში რო ჩავჯდეთ, გთხოვთ. გამარჯობა, კარგად. I hope everyone enjoyed coffee break and opportunity for networking. Now we have to continue. Just a moment. Now we are privileged to hear from our keynote speakers and hear from their expertise on consumer policy and competition. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Ms. Teresa Moreira. I just want to check. Mr. Angelo, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. So we can continue.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Allow me to start by, again, thanking very much the organizers for, again, inviting UN Trade and Development, better known as UNCTAD, to not only attend but intervene in this conference. It is a great pleasure for me and my colleagues to be here today. And as I've said in previous conferences, I think that this joint co-hosting of an international conference on competition and consumer protection really sets a very important example across the world, so to speak, since it is of the utmost importance that we ensure that cross-cutting issues such as competition and consumer protection are well coordinated and subject of collaboration with sector-specific regulators as the ones that are co-organizing the event today, so the financial sector, energy and water and communications sectors, and also other governmental bodies, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I want, if you allow me, to address a special thanks to the chairman of the Georgian Competition and Consumer Agency, Irakli Levinadze, and congratulate him for the very impressive record of 10 years of achievement of the agency. It has been a pleasure to observe and to be, in a way, involved in that progress. And again, I think this is something really worth celebrating. I have a presentation, which I hope... Could I please have the presentation ready? Thank you. Well, it's a little bit of a challenging topic, especially because I am the first keynote speaker. But I wanted very briefly just to remind that we, United Nations Trade and Development, that is to say UNCTAD, have the privilege of having a very wide mandate on all issues related to international trade and development, which encompass investment, logistics, technology, and of course, competition and consumer policies. And also to tell you that, of course, we provide this very wide platform because we have 195 members, and we are focused on assisting developing countries in better integrating the world economy. This year we celebrate 60th anniversary of UNCTAD, which of course has led to a number of reflections, and some of these reflections will be translated next year in our 16th Ministerial Conference, which will take place in the last quarter of 2025. Well, we already know, most of you who are usual participants in this conference, that UNCTAD is also the focal point both for competition and consumer protection within the United Nations system. We are privileged to be the custodians of the only two truly international instruments adopted by consensus by the United Nations General Assembly, the UN Set on Competition and the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection, which will celebrate 40 years next year. So I thought that since this is a keynote speech, I would talk a little bit about the overall global economic and social context. We are going through challenging times. I think one way or another, all times have been challenging in different ways, but it is true that the overall context is very relevant for competition and consumer protection policies and for the respective authorities to identify priorities. So I just wanted to start by highlighting a few current or recent data regarding issues that I believe are relevant to this reflection. So the first one on international trade. Of course, as you can see, this year there have been quite a lot of progress as far as international trade is concerned. Digital services playing a major part. I wanted to tell you that in any case, UNCTAD, the latest UNCTAD Ministerial Conference in 2021 already, 3 years ago, in a way, seemed very far away, but identified three major challenges that we believe remain relevant and that we believe that play a decisive influence also on the implementation of competition and consumer policies. These challenges relate to inequality and vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, both on the rise since the pandemic outbreak in 2020, so in the last 4 years. The other big challenge is climate change and environmental degradation. It was already mentioned today by previous speakers that currently COP29 is taking place in Baku, and despite some enthusiasm, I think there are still concerns about what the real outcome is going to be in a week where the G20, that is to say, the leaders of the 20 most representative economies from developed and developing countries also met in Brazil. And the third and final global challenge is, of course, the uneven digital transformation and digital divide. So, continuing with the trends or these highlights of the global economic and social context, I would talk about economic regionalism, since so many countries are involved in preferential trade agreements, as we can see from this map, which is a map of the World Trade Organization up to date. At the same time, in the other column, you have the number of regional economic organizations of developing countries, also on the rise. And interestingly, as I believe I shared in previous conferences, all of them having in common the selection or the election of competition law and policy, and sometimes also of consumer protection at regional level. So this is clearly a confirmation of the cross-cutting importance of both policies. Then some data on maritime transport, because this is also very relevant, especially from a competition point of view, since there is huge market concentration, also playing a negative impact in the price of goods that are exported and imported worldwide. As I mentioned, developments on digital economy and technology. Some data on environment and related trades. You will know that, of course, there are huge concerns with the impact of international trade in climate change and environmental degradation. And in particularly, the topic of plastics has been of increasing concern. And there will be soon negotiations on plastics, and that is relevant also from a consumer protection point of view, because this is something that we are working on with other colleagues that are environmental experts. Finally, a slide just on population, just to confirm that, well, in the OECD member states, overall population is aging, and this generates very specific challenges due to the needs of elderly consumers, and due to the needs of citizens that from a competition point of view may not be fully prepared to make the most out of, for instance, digital markets, or maybe less sensitive to the challenges of environmental degradation. And of course, developing countries, by contrast, having very large percentage of young population, which is very promising, but of course also entails some challenges due to the digital economy and the environmental overall concerns. Well, so far there have been some good macroeconomic prospects for next year. I know that recently a number of changes in countries all over the world will probably have an impact also in the economy next year, but I believe that we need to keep working together and keep being positive. Now, let me also tell you about the progress of the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, agreed in 2015, and on the achievement of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. unfortunately, so far, in 2024, only about 16% of the 169 goals has been achieved, which means to say that we are lagging behind as a planet, as the world. And this also underlines the need to address especially the areas where there are more serious gaps, usually with negative impacts for developing countries, for the poorer, for the most vulnerable. And every year we have this assessment that really leads to a call of action. I just highlighted some of the conclusions of UNCTAD's latest report, which should be interpreted as a call for all countries and all stakeholders to do better in the future. Now let me get to the real topic, which of course concerns competition and consumer protection. So first of all, I would like just to highlight a few issues, but let me start with competition policy broader goals. So since the pandemic, we have seen, I believe, a very interesting adjustment of competition law and policy to the needs of being fit for purpose. And I think that all those actively involved in the implementation, well, in the design and the implementation of public policies are nowadays very much aware of this need to remain fit for purpose and to ensure that the tools and the concrete objectives you pursue are responding, are addressing the challenges, the needs, and the priorities of your country's citizens, your consumers, your businesses. I wanted to tell you that, of course, for an organization like UNCTAD, which is devoted to developing countries, among these goals, we, of course, have identified that a lot of developing countries actually confer to competition law and policy also the responsibility of pursuing some public interest considerations. And these sometimes are translated into employment, the protection and encouragement of small and medium-sized companies, sustainable development, and in some developing countries in Africa, for instance, even what we could consider affirmative action. That is to say, better opportunities and integration of groups of population, which can include micro and family businesses that have been somehow left behind. So, competition law and policy, from our point of view, has remained extremely relevant because it was across the world able to adjust to the challenges brought by the pandemic, to the challenges brought by the cost of living crisis that followed and that were enhanced by geopolitical tensions all over the world. And this has also entailed a wider and stronger effort of collaboration and coordination with other public bodies. I mentioned already sector-specific regulators, which also includes data protection authorities and any other regulators that are engaged, for instance, in the big challenges that are faced across the world regarding digital markets and sustainability. So I think as competition authorities, all of us can be proud of these achievements. And I think it is very important to share the achievements so that others that are less experienced, that are more resource constrained, can feel encouraged to follow these examples. On digital markets, well, I'm sure all of us have been observing the progresses. I think it can be said that strong law enforcement has been on the rise, even if in some cases this entailed law amendments, expansion of merger control. We have seen also a rise of the adoption on regulation, usually ex-ante regulation or regulation that can be combined with competition and consumer protection law enforcement. We know that consumers and users remain very worried about data protection and privacy for consumers, that all of us that are also engaged in consumer protection remain very committed to improve consumer and business information and education, that for e-commerce to flourish, we need to improve online dispute resolution and redress, and also online product safety. And of course, since last year, I believe that the impact of artificial intelligence, both from a competition and a consumer protection point of view, has raised new concerns due to the possibility of misleading consumers, of facilitating collusion between businesses. But these are issues that are being identified and have been discussed at numerous international and regional fora. On sustainability, I should say that this is a topic of great relevance all over. Again, the COP29, I think, underlines the relevance of this topic. I wanted to share with you that since last year, UNCTAD is one of the co-leads in the One Planet Network, which associates the UN Environment Programme, the government of Germany, and Consumers International, the World Federation of Consumer Associations. And we are very much committed to improve consumer information towards sustainable consumption. You will know that for some years, within some of the most advanced jurisdictions, competition law and policy has been explored as an instrument to also contribute to pursue sustainability. So especially in some European Union member states and at the European Union level, clearly because of the overall EU commitment towards a green transition, competition law and policy is part of the toolkit that countries and the European Commission should use to pursue sustainability. But I should say that for developing countries, competition authorities, this is a challenge not yet so clear, maybe because overall developing countries have contributed less to the current status of environmental degradation in the world. And I think finance for support of this big effort of adjusting to climate change needs to be clear and needs to be agreed upon before a further commitment is taken. So again, this is an issue that is very relevant from the competition and the consumer protection point of view. And I think we all know, even as consumers, how we face often misleading environmental claims. So greenwashing has been occupying consumer protection authorities all over. And this is clearly an area where consumer authorities and competition authorities can work further together. The final global challenge that I mentioned is, of course, related to vulnerabilities and inequalities. I wanted to tell you that when we talk about vulnerabilities and inequalities, there has been an increasing interest to discuss how competition law and policy can contribute to reduce inequalities. Of course, both objectives or both challenges need, first of all, a strong social policy and the contribution of many other policies like health policy, education policy, etc. But we can think, for instance, of small micro family businesses that also need to have a fair chance of competing in the markets. We can talk about vulnerable groups of consumers, children, young people, the elderly, migrants, etc. So these are issues that should be in our minds when we talk about how markets and society function, due to this great concern also with the social impact of markets choices and consumption choices. Now I would like to share with you something that I believe that usually it's not on our agendas. This is some of the conclusions, some of the findings of UNCTAD's Digital Economy Report of 2024, which was launched this summer, and which very interestingly addresses the intersection between digitalization and sustainability. Why is this important? Well, this is important because digitalization is having a significant and growing impact on the environment, and there is an urgent need to foster environmental sustainability also when we talk about the digital economy. Digitalization has expanded to become a significant contributor of GHG emissions, and maybe some of us will find it hard to believe, but the ICT sector is estimated to account for a similar magnitude as the maritime industry or aviation to the overall emissions picture. So, in addition, there have been quite separated policy discussions, on one side on digital economy, on the other side on climate change and environmental degradation. And we need to understand that there are serious environmental impacts from digital products and devices that can be observed from the production, use, and end of life of digital devices and infrastructures. So I wanted just to share a few slides for you to be informed about this. Of course, this means that digital economy needs to be more circular, and this requires, again, actions by all stakeholders, and from our point of view, in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 12 on responsible consumption and production. It is essential to design products for sustainability, making them possible to repair, refurbish, and recycle, encourage resource efficiency further, facilitate recovery and reuse, and fight program obsolescence in digital products. I am moving forward, and I would like to talk also a little bit about the way forward. I wanted to start, of course, with the broader possible overall picture, and I chose to talk about some of the recent, latest, more relevant international developments, which, not surprisingly, come from the United Nations framework. So the first one is the Pact for the Future, which was adopted in September 2024, and which covers a very broad range of issues, including on sustainable development, climate change, digital cooperation, and the transformation of global governance. I will skip the important issues of peace and security, just because this is not, of course, our area of expertise, but I would like to tell you that on sustainable development, climate, and financing for development, there were very important consensual conclusions. First of all, the need for reform of the international financial architecture so that it better represents and serves developing countries. strengthening the global financial safety net, and accelerating measures to address the challenge of climate change. Of course, we should still wait to see what happens with the outcome of COP29, but at least as of September, there was encouragement that there would be enough financing for especially the less resource developing countries to be able to adjust to the new reality of climate change. Also, the pact included a global digital compact, which is a commitment on the design, use, and governance of technology to the benefits of all, which, among other things, seeks to make an online space safe for all, especially children, through actions by governments, tech companies, and social media, which seeks to make data more open and accessible, and which corresponds to the first global commitment to data governance and requiring countries to take concrete actions by 2030. Another important issue, of course, is this brief on artificial intelligence that establishes a governance framework that aims to be inclusive and that calls on all governments and stakeholders to work together, establishing a policy dialogue and a fund to support those who are a little bit lagging behind. As I mentioned already, COP29 and yesterday's, I believe, G20 leaders meetings are not all necessarily 100% consistent, let me put it this way. But in any case, it is very important to underline that in the G20, obviously in COP29, there will be all countries represented, and these commitments are extremely relevant for the future. Now, on competition and consumer protection, what is UNCTAD doing? I wanted just to highlight a few issues. Those of you who follow us or work closer with us are fully aware. I wanted to mention that we will continue doing work on cross-border cartels, which remain extremely relevant. And, we heard about Georgia's track record, so to speak, and you see that there are a lot of sectors that are still cartel-prone in a way, so requiring not only strong market monitoring, but also very robust law enforcement. We will also continue working on food markets with our colleagues from commodities. We will continue studying and mapping energy markets, also an important sector already shared today. And we will be improving the UNCTAD model law on competition commentaries. On consumer protection, I think for next year, we will celebrate the 40 years of the guidelines since this is a unique occasion. And we will hopefully achieve agreement on the new product safety recommendation. We will be disseminating a technical note on AI and consumer protection. And we are also completing a draft gender checklist for consumer protection authorities. Of course, the review conference in July 2025 will allow a unique opportunity to discuss the implementation of UNCTAD's mandates in both fields. It will review our experience of 20 years in voluntary peer reviews on competition, and we will discuss further synergies between competition and consumer policies. I end on this note, nothing very original, but of course, we think that despite the current challenges and the latest developments on multipolarity, geopolitical conflicts, the rise of protectionism and fragmentation, raised concerns, I believe, to all of us as citizens, as workers, as business, as public officials, as politicians. I wanted to quote something that UNCTAD Secretary General Rebecca Greenspan said 2 days ago or yesterday in the G20 Leaders Conference, which I believe is very interesting. Multipolarity is a fact, but multilateralism is a choice. This means to say that we need to make sure that multipolarity is associated with cooperation. And of course, it is very important that we commit to values, continuing to mainstream competition and consumer protection, since the freedom of enterprise and the freedom of choice of consumers are essential in a market economy. And therefore, within the current context, or taking into consideration future different developments at world level, competition and consumer protection policies will remain crucial to serve consumers, to provide opportunities to all businesses, and also encompassing the social and environmental dimensions. The holistic approach is something that UNCTAD has always been advocating for. I believe that this conference, with the wide partnership that has been put in place, is a very good example of how this can work. And of course, cooperation at all levels, bilateral, regional, international, formal, or through arrangements, is extremely important in this multipolar world that we expect to remain, in any case, hopeful to provide opportunities for all of us, and do count on UNCTAD to make sure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Thanks to our keynote speaker, Ms. Teresa Moreira. Your insights and opinions will undoubtedly influence our future discussion. Before we go any more further, I just want to make one small remark. Isabelle Perignon was originally supposed to join us today, but she couldn't make it, unfortunately. So instead of her, Mr. Angelo Grieco will be joining us online. I just want to check connection. Mr. Angelo, can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, we can hear as well. So we can continue. Please proceed. Let's welcome to Mr. Angelo.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all the participants and the fellow panelists, Teresa, Christina, Andreas. Thank you very much to the Georgian authorities and the organizers of this conference for inviting the European Commission here. So as Isabelle Perignon could not be here, and she sends truly her regards and wishes for a fruitful conference, I will represent DG Justice as the head of the unit in charge of enforcement of consumer law redress. I'm particularly grateful you have invited us to intervene on such an interesting and challenging topic, which is basically the relation between competition and consumer protection. To start on this, I should recall that competition and consumer policy pursue mutually reinforcing goals. So they are there to preserve competitiveness of the European market and of European businesses. But at the same time, they are there to protect and provide benefits to individuals, to consumers who buy products and use services. Now, to strengthen competitiveness is one of the most prominent objectives set out in political guidelines of our President, Madame von der Leyen, for our single market. One of the basic ideas behind this concept is that if those markets are open with multiple players, those players have the incentive to compete hard and innovate hard, to bring consumers the best choices, the best quality, the best services at the best price. Mario Draghi, in his report on competitiveness, put a strong role and focus on consumers, emphasizing that if consumers are adequately empowered, they can significantly contribute to increasing the competitiveness of the Union economy. For instance, by stimulating consumer demand for sustainable products, or supporting the development of digital passport, providing the relevant consumer information about the product or service, and information about its entire value chain. Now, if we look at some recent regulatory developments, both in competition and consumer area, we can say that the central role of consumer welfare is very well reflected in those developments. So, for example, in recent implementation tools adopted by the Commission, the European Commission in the competition area, if you take the market definition notes, which many of us now probably know by heart, it was revised this year, and for the first time since its adoption in 1997. Importantly, for the ends, and the subject matter of our discussion today, this notice now recognizes the importance of non-price parameters for market definition. What are these sort of new or enhanced parameters? They include innovation, quality, reliable supply, and I underline sustainability and durability of products. So this revision is important to recall because it shows how much consumer habits and approaches have evolved, and how important it is for competition enforcement to be in tune with those realities. Now, consumers nowadays are concerned not just by how much they pay for a product or a service, but also, and more, in many instances, by the impact of their choice on the environment. And they want to be active contributors to the green transition. So the green, we can call it transformation of European society and economy. This is also why several merger decisions in the competition area reflect the fact that on certain markets, and have taken into account the fact that on certain markets, consumers express a preference for more sustainable products or services. Sustainability is just one very good example of the intersection and interaction between competition and consumer policy. And they indeed rely on consumer preferences and what is valuable for consumers. Now, these developments in the competition area are well mirrored in a very complementary manner in the regulatory developments we have had recently in consumer in the area of sustainable consumption and the green economy, with the recent adoption of directive on the right to repair, and still very recent adoption of directive on empowering consumers for the green transition. So instruments enhance transparency and reliability of environmental information for consumers. Now, if another very important legislative project, which is the Green Claims Directive, which the Commission proposed a while ago, goes forward, we will also have soon a reliable and scientific methodology to assess the substantiation of environmental claims. Let's think about how important this is when we are assessing, claims relating to offsetting emission and carbon footprint. Now, the other big area of intersection between consumer and competition policy are the digital markets. Now, among the challenges that the digital markets pose today is the fact that you have a handful of the large digital platforms that hold significant market power. So digital platforms nowadays are the largest and most powerful companies in the world, and they are deeply embedded in our daily lives. So we rely on these platforms for everyday activities, and they become essential to the functioning of our economy. And also, if we look at business, the business world, they are now particularly critical, or I would say essential, for businesses to seek and to reach out to consumers, so to conduct their business, their very business. Now, in this area, if we look at competition, the adoption of the Digital Market Act was clearly a big step forward in protecting businesses and consumers in these market conditions, in the market circumstances. And this is a piece of legislation which lays down clear rules for big platforms, do's and don'ts, and which aim at stopping them from imposing unfair conditions on businesses and consumers. So the decision here was about developing a digital environment, so go in the direction of developing a digital environment that gives more choice to consumers and creates new opportunities for smaller, innovative tech companies. So it was time that Europe set the rules of the game in a way that ensured the digital markets are fair and open. Now, if you look at the consumer area, alongside and in parallel, there was quite a lot of regulatory activities also during the current mandate, which now, as a matter of days, will come to an end, to reinforce consumer protection. So we look, for example, at the Digital Service Act, which has a number of key provisions, key consumer protection provisions, and it comes, on transparency of advertising, compliance by design, protection of minors, and which come also with a very strong centralized enforcement, similarly also to the AI Act provides also for risk control safeguards, which benefits both businesses and consumers. Now, the Commission, in this area, so the regulation, which is already massive, so the Commission is there, does not have any big plans to further propose legislation, but, we carried out an assessment on consumer legislation to see whether they are still sufficient to provide the right level of protection in the digital area. And out of this, the conclusion after a number of evaluations which have been conducted in the past 2 years is that still there are a number of very targeted and limited gaps that need to be filled. So you will have seen that one of the priorities for the new mandate will be to adopt the Digital Fairness Act, which is not, it doesn't intend to duplicate or to add, I would say, a burden, especially on businesses, on new obligations, but to deal with very specific aspects which are not probably fully covered. So to fill some of the gaps in the current regulatory environment, in relation, for example, dark patterns, protection of minors, addictive design. Consumers nowadays face difficulties in cancelling digital contracts. They spend too much time on online services due to addictive design, and they are also exposed to problematic practices by social media influencers. So the number of these problems will be addressed in the Digital Fairness Act, and our assessment has basically concluded that the estimated financial detriment suffered by consumers from these practices, which are still not well regulated, is at least of 8 billion per year. Now, if we look at enforcement, in the digital sphere, especially, the priority is to have consumer and competition enforcement working together. And we see, in fact, more and more the same practices from the same companies raising concern from a competition standpoint, but also breaking consumer rules. Together with often also infringement of rules in other areas, like, for example, data protection. So there are increasingly cases where you see consumer and competition experts, enforcers working side by side. One very good example is the recent Meta case, so the pay and consent model, which is problematic from both consumers and competition people. On the consumer side, we look at the model in relation, obviously, relation, we assess whether that model is compatible, the representation of that model is compatible to the relevant consumer protection rules. And under the coordination of the Commission, the Network of National Consumer Authorities, called the CPC network, identified several practices that raise concerns in relation to the practices of Meta and could potentially be considered unfair. The investigation in breach of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Unfair Contract Terms Directive. Investigation is ongoing. One example of this is the use of the word free to mislead consumers who do not want to subscribe against a fee. Meta requires them to accept that the company can make revenues from using their personal data to show them personalized ads and similar practices. So, on the DMA side, if you look at the DMA side, so the competition side of this case, the preliminary findings are also in breach, have also been found in breach of the DMA. And for very, I would say, interrelated reason that to make a business model pay consent does not allow users to opt for a service that uses less of their personal data. It basically does not allow consumers, users and consumers to exercise the right freely to consent to the combination of their personal data. Now, it's not surprising that there is also a parallel investigation by data protection authorities on this case. So this example is to show how we require, now what is required in enforcement is innovative thinking, multidisciplinary solutions, and also new forms of cross-border cooperation between authorities, which are responsible for the different areas of law. So now, if we look at enforcement, consumer competition enforcement, this is an area where there are still major differences. And I think if you look at consumer enforcement, not only in relation to competition, but also in relation to other enforcement areas, because at the moment there is an asymmetry in between the level and the strength of consumer enforcement and competition enforcement, DMA, Digital Service Act, the AI Act, where, for these other instruments, the choice has been to centralize enforcement for big cases, to give European Commission very strong powers to investigate sanctioned companies with turnover-based deterrent penalties. Now, this asymmetry in consumer, we don't have this, has led the Commission to start to review the current enforcement system already 2 years ago. Because if we look at consumer enforcement, we see that this is a competence which is entirely in the member states. While the Commission has, however, a prominent role as we coordinate a network of authorities, the CPC, Consumer Protection Cooperation Network. This is a network which brings together the consumer protection authorities of all the member states and the European Economic Area countries, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. This is a network which has produced, the action of this network has produced results, and over the past years, we carried out approximately 20 coordinated actions against big market players. So as a result of this action, joint enforcement actions, several big companies like Google, WhatsApp, Amazon, Tinder modified their conduct to bring it in line with consumer law. Lately, you might have seen that we also published an action against Temu and an action against Apple for geo-blocking violation. But enforcement nowadays is more complicated. There's a growing list of challenges, many of them related to the steep acceleration of e-commerce, to growing digitalization, And these are challenges which are impossible to address without strong enforcement tools. Situation on consumer markets at the moment, our sweeps, so our monitoring, it is joint online checks that we do with the authorities show that on average, only 50% of websites, we look at digital, comply with basic consumer rights. And then we have the additional issues of traders which are not established in the Union and who do not necessarily respect consumer rights under EU law, but that target very aggressively Union consumers. As I mentioned before, another area where we need strong enforcement is the green economy. So we have a lot of new legislation where consumer law, and when we talk about big cases, the cooperation system, so the CPC regulation cooperation system that we have, is the only instrument to address those infringements. So it is clear to address all these challenges, we need to do something, and we need to strengthen enforcement. And this is why in the Commission we have started already reviewing the current system already 2 years ago. And the reflection that we are conducting at the moment is focuses mainly around two blocks. So one is the possibility to centralize investigation and sanctioning powers for clearly defined union-wide cases we call high-impact infringements at the union level, for example, with the Commission, and bring basically that way also consumer enforcement at the level of the SA, EMA, and competition. And then the second part, of the reflections concern how we can improve coordination within authorities to address cases which will still be dealt through coordination and not by direct centralized enforcement powers. Of course, and once again here, if you look at competition and consumers, competition is an excellent example of the direction we should go when we think about improving consumer enforcement. Now, to conclude, if we look at our priorities in enforcement, is first of all to ensure that all different strands, like competition, consumers, digital service acts, AI Act, work closely together to ensure they can mutually support each other and also guarantee that there is complementarity and consistency of the outcomes in the investigations. We have seen very recently with the Court of Justice judgment in the Bundeskanzleramt case that there is, to mutually assist each other, it should be an obligation for authorities, even when they work in different enforcement areas. The other priorities, as I said, for consumer law, in consumer area, to have stronger enforcement to be able to deal with very key high-profile cases. These are the practices by big platforms and large market players which have a massive impact as they affect millions of consumers across the Union at the same time. For those who have followed the hearing in the European Parliament of our Commissioner-designate, McGrath, you will have seen very clearly that he set this as a key priority for the next Commission mandate. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Angelo. Thank you for your valuable contributions to our conference. So I kindly asking you to stay online for upcoming discussion end of this session. Okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Now it is my honor to introduce Ms. Cristina Cafara, the Deputy Director of the CPR Competition Research Network, who is also joining us online. Ms. Cristina, can you hear us? To check connection. Okay. Welcome to Miss Christina. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So let me start by saying I'm really sorry not to be there in person. I would have loved to be there in person, but as a testimony to my dedication, I am now in Washington, D.C., where it is 3 a.m. And so I certainly can tell you it is the middle of the night, and I would prefer to be there with all of you. Again, thank you for having me. It is an important event. My background, for those who don't know me, is I have practiced as a competition economist, an antitrust specialist, an economic expert for the best part of 25 years. So on the basis of that experience, I think I have developed something of a critical voice around what we are currently doing as an antitrust community and how we should be really thinking about this. And I think that it is important to take this kind of broader sense of the world we live in. I wanted this intervention to be about antitrust, competition enforcement, and the political economy. Because at these conferences, at competition events around the world, there is a tendency for us competition experts to talk amongst ourselves, to talk to each other as if the world outside didn't really exist. We talk about competition enforcement almost as a pure science, a discipline. We are the priests and priestesses of this discipline. We know what we're doing. It is all scientific, and in some way there is consensus on what the objectives and the practice should be. My position is fundamentally challenging this because the reality is, for anyone who lives in the real world, is that the world is today on fire on many dimensions. Let's just look around us, come down from the magic tower in which we practice antitrust. We meet corporate companies, CEOs, their general counsel, and look at the reality. It is certainly the case in my lengthy experience, and when we look back even further in time, that competition enforcement is not a science, is not pure, is not apolitical. It is not the case that we're basing it on some sort of pure economic analysis that makes this a pure science. We've arrived in some way in 2024 at wisdom, and now we practice in ways that are not controversial. They're absolutely inevitably correct. It is important to realize that competition enforcement is a product of its time. It is never completely neutral. It is not apolitical. It is political, essentially political. And if you look back briefly at the history of how we got here, the kind of competition vision and philosophy that we effectively practice in the main today, again, was not born out of nowhere. It was born out of a very deliberate effort in the United States by President Reagan in the 1980s to establish a vision of antitrust that was pro-corporations, pro-Wall Street, and favored the notion that corporate concentration, for example, was not necessarily problematic, that many of the practices that firm adopted were actually pro-competitive. The word efficient became the North Star of competition enforcement because he very deliberately embarked in a process, in a plan of certainly turning the whole competition establishment in that direction. There was an explicit effort to call academics, intellectuals, the Chicago School, people like Bork and Stigler. So the reality is that at that time, a very specific vision of what antitrust should be like was adopted and established. A vision that said monopolies are not necessarily bad. Monopolies are efficient, potentially efficient. We have efficiency as what we should be pursuing. Consumer welfare is the magic word. And that kind of vision, which was, let's not forget, very much favorable to corporate power in Wall Street, became adopted also in Europe in the early 2000s. So that vision established itself in what we then called the more economic approach. Andreas Mund, who is a friend, of course, is very much aware and was there at the time in which economists like him and myself were pushing this idea of the more economic approach. So where we got to is we adopted this vision, but then this got challenged in a very fundamental way in the last 10, 15 years by first the emergence of the financial crisis, then COVID, then the irrepressible expansion of the digital monopolies. We've seen that view of the world essentially develop, their position essentially develop in ways that we could not ultimately control. So that sort of certainty that we had, the way in which we were thinking about the world at the time, the way we were thinking about the so-called neoliberal consensus came under a lot of question. This has been true particularly in the United States. It's not the case that we, under the Biden administration, have developed a real alternative, post-neoliberal, complete system of beliefs. One important thing happened. In antitrust, we did put in place a piece, and when I say we, I mean the enforcers in the current and yet to an almost final Biden administration. There was a real major push by enforcers like Lina Khan and Jonathan Kanter to actually put in place a different perspective that was not the pro-monopoly, pro-Wall Street, pro-corporate vision of the previous era. Remember, in the United States, there was no enforcement, almost no enforcement for 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, because it reflected that prevailing view. What has happened in the last 5 years, under the current batch of enforcers, has been an incredible transformation, which has been a product of the political economy we live in. These enforcers, Lina Khan, Jonathan Kanter, and of course Steve Warren, with the support of President Biden, have absolutely pushed a very different vision of how antitrust should be enforced, not allowing every merger, almost every merger, to go through with marginal remedies and undertakings, aggressively pursuing monopolies, not just because of price effect, but because of power. There has been this real shift in the notion that what we should worry about is not just whether price effects occur, whether there is some small price increase or large price increase which is brought about by the monopolies, but we should worry about the way they wield power in our society. They dominate the economic discourse, the democratic discourse. We should worry about power of firms with large presence because it is ultimately important for democracy. And so this very different vision is being called political. There's been a great deal of criticism and pushback around it because critics, those of course who were comfortable in the previous world in which we can all merge, in which we can all get together, in which we can all more or less do things that are not really favorable to consumer, but in a sense we turn a blind eye. Those that kind of described what Lina Khan and Jonathan Kanter have been trying to do in the US as a political turn of antitrust. It is not political. It is just the fact that antitrust is political in essence, in its nature. It was political when 40 years ago the neoliberal vision was established. It is and must be political now because the world we live in is on fire. We cannot any longer just focus on ultimately merger in the way we've done it for the last 20 years. In Europe, in the last 10 years, 4,000 mergers have been approved, 9 have been blocked. This is effectively a merger factory. If we do look at the levels of concentration in the economy, they have been rising. Not, of course, rising because of antitrust solely, but antitrust does not remotely slow down the concentration of power in the economy, leading to increased margins, extractive behavior by companies, particularly in the digital sphere, in which we are currently totally failing to tame these digital monopolies. Let's just not delude ourselves that we are succeeding, because we are not. Now, I know this is an unpopular view, and it is one for which I'm criticized, but the reality is that when you look at the actual outcomes of the effort that we seemingly put in place, they are not there. We have failed to move the dial in a significant way in the last 10 years on digital monopolies. We certainly in Europe have made an effort. We have tried to enforce, but there has been no change on the ground. Cases against Google, cases against Apple, cases against Amazon, and I have worked disclosure on some of those cases. Those cases have not remotely held back the power of these companies. Let's just be honest about this. That's why we pivoted to digital regulation, which is a great thing. We cannot do without it. At the same time, there is a question as to how much we are achieving through it. My own concern is that digital regulation is useful, it's a good thing to have. At the same time, it is going to have only marginal impact on the market. Why? Because ultimately, these companies are too powerful, these companies are very difficult to really pin down, and they will not change their behavior in a fundamental way. We will get some marginal results, but not anything that changes the relative picture of power. So, look, the reality is that we pat ourselves on the back and we kind of have conferences in which we talk in a vacuum, in a silo amongst ourselves about antitrust as if it were something that is doing something. But ultimately it is not doing very much, certainly in many jurisdictions. We have also had in Europe at this point another big shock, which is, of course, the Draghi report. For those not familiar, Professor Draghi, former Italian Prime Minister, of course, has issued an important document in which he is exposing the fundamental problems that Europe faces. Of course, antitrust is not the cause for Europe's ailments. The fact that we have low productivity growth, that we are doing poorly in terms of innovation and investment, that our economic performance is sinking, kind of stuck as we are between US and China on the other side. Competition enforcement is not the cause for our predicament, but what this report has exposed is also that Europe is currently, for those who weren't listening or weren't looking, in a place where Europe is in a significant level of trouble. So what competition enforcement can do is certainly not lift the economic fate of Europe out of its current doldrum, but certainly there needs to be urgently a thinking about how can competition enforcement help that mission. Europe has a significant problem, which is how do we actually inject growth, innovation, investment into a continent which is otherwise in significant levels of trouble and decline. And we know the causes have to do with fragmentation, lack of internal market, all of that. But what is the role that competition enforcement should play in this particular political economy? And that question isn't really one that people want to address and ask. I've been repeatedly saying that we need to urgently think about what competition enforcement should do, what competition rules should do to support the European predicament. There is no willingness to really engage in a meaningful way in that debate. There is lip service paid to, yes, we need to support Europe, but there is no intellectual research and development around the tools, the thinking, the vision, the things we should be doing in Europe. And finally, the third big vector of change, which has hit us like a freight train, is of course the US election. So we start with a big vector of change, which is the transformation of the philosophy from neoliberal to post-neoliberal. Europe kind of missed that. We didn't want to discuss it. Big discussion in the US. We haven't had it in Europe. That's why the City Conference is still saying to each other, we know what we're doing. We're implementing consumer welfare. Oh, we have a notion of consumer welfare that's a little bit broader. We include quality and innovation. You know, this is so narrow still. It means we are living in a bubble in which we are not looking left and right. Second vector of change, Draghi is saying, everyone, we are thinking, what are we doing in order to help develop Europe out of that predicament? Third vector of change, of course, we have a new president. This is a major shock because what is happening is totally unknown. What will be happening is totally unknown. I'm in Washington this week talking to people. There is total chaos and disbelief and lack of clarity about what the future will be like. It is known that President Trump is transactional. He will play corporations in ways that favor him. And the way in which Europe will be placed in that world is certainly not a position that favors us. How will President Trump support big American corporations against European enforcement? Just ask yourself that question. How will President Trump position himself when American corporations go and tell him, these Europeans have been discriminating against great, big, successful American companies? What's stopping him from saying, I've got your back, tell the Europeans to get lost? So, I'm exaggerating, but not quite. I think these are questions that are, of course, being asked at some level, but these are the questions that face us. We are in a perfect storm. And the question is, what are we going to do as competition community to wake up, not to come to this conference and chat to one another about this little case or that little case, delude ourselves that we're succeeding in taming the big tech companies who are absolutely dominating not just the sort of level of apps and services. We all get very agitated about search, and we get agitated about social networking and e-commerce and app store. That's all fine. Let's think about what's below that. Let's think about what is all of that level of apps and services premised on. Who owns the data centers, the compute, the connectivity, the cable under the sea, that all of that level of digital services is actually delivered on? The same companies. We as Europeans own almost nothing of the digital infrastructure that these services are premised on. If that infrastructure turns hostile, we have a massive problem. And yet, we are talking in competition circles about, consumer welfare, about the market definition notice. What are we thinking? This is so beside the point in a world in which we are literally on fire. And we need to be thinking seriously about what our role in all of this is if we want to participate and help our predicament. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Miss Christina. Thank you. Thank you for your motivational speech. Trust me, it's great pleasure and privilege having you here on the conference. Please stay online and let me ask to the audience to join us for the discussion. If there is any question, please raise your hand. შეკითხვების შემთხვევაში შეგიძლიათ ხელი აიწიოთ, შემიძლია გადმოგცეთ მიკროფონი. თუ არის, რა თქმა უნდა, შეკითხვები. შეკითხვები არ არის. Okay. Mr. Angelo, Miss Christina, are you here?
Yes.
There is no questions. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you. It's really a privilege having both of you here. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. And lastly, we have privilege of hearing from Mr. Munst. Although he could not be here with us in person, he has kindly prepared a video message for us. Please, proceed.
Thank you very much for the occasion for a keynote speech here at your third international conference on competition and consumer protection in Tiflis. Competition policy is always debated when
ბოდიში ტექნიკური ხარვეზია, ახლავე აღმოფხვრით.
Thank you very much for the occasion for a keynote speech here at your third international conference on competition and consumer protection in Tiflis. Competition policy is always debated when competitiveness is an issue. And for the time being, in all countries, in all regions, competitiveness is a big issue. It's going to be the headline of the new European Commission in Brussels. And of course, it's going to be very important for the new Commissioner of Competition of the European Commission in Brussels. And, of course, it is also important for competition agencies around the world. And I think that we are very well prepared for that debate. There have been various reports recently dealing with competitiveness. There has been Mario Draghi's report on the future of European competitiveness, which also deals with state aid. There has been the latter report that was called Much More Than a Market, and there was a report by the Commission protecting competition in a changing world. And when competitiveness is debated, the discussion about the major tool of competition agencies, merger control, is not far away. So merger control and the right approach in merger control is fiercely debated in the context of competitiveness of the European Union. And there is kind of a very common thinking among politicians that more competitiveness requires larger undertakings, national and European champions. And thus, competitiveness requires a weaker merger control. Personally, I'm very thankful that the Draghi report is very reserved and tempered on that question, and rightly so. Yes, champions are important. They often form the core of a cluster of industry or services. They attract companies. Champions attract employees. They foster skills among companies and employees, and they foster innovation. And yes, sometimes champions are important to cope with huge companies abroad in China and in the US. But what is even more important, there must be champions on the basis of their own capabilities. Champions as a result of competition on the merits and not as the result of state interventions and state subsidies. Competition does not limit champions, it rather fosters champions. And only a company that is very strong on the home market will be a strong competitor on world markets. So competitiveness is the result of competition on the merits. This thinking might not be so common, but it is confirmed by practice, and it is confirmed by many theoretical studies like the Commission's report, Protecting Competition in a Changing World, where it is stated the economy as a whole greatly benefits from competitive markets. So we as competition agencies, we are not against large companies. We are not against companies, but we are against companies that are state-driven and that are state-driven monopolies or duopolists to the detriment of the consumer. Against this background, competitiveness can be achieved by a strong single European market, by less bureaucracy, by competitive structures with regard to taxation, to access to capital, well-skilled workers, but surely not by weakening merger control. We all know that competition results in low prices, good quality with regard to products and services. This is very consumer-oriented. But what matters most, at least to me, is that competition also takes care and fosters innovation. And that is so important because innovation is about future wealth of a society, future wealth of an economy. With regard to innovation, also the Draghi report states on the future of European competitiveness, merger evaluations should assess how the proposed concentration will affect future innovation potential in critical innovation areas. Well, unfortunately, there is no SNP test for innovation. But we must be able to deal with these cases. We must be able to deal with theories of harm that are based on innovation. And there are good examples at the European level and also here in Germany at the Bundeskartellamt that it is feasible to assess innovation-related theories of harm. These theories are more complex. They require a deep analysis. They provide a bit less predictability in merger cases, but we have to deal with it, and we are going to manage it. A very practical question on merger control today is how do we make sure in our jurisdictions that we catch the relevant transactions? The acquisition of small companies with a low turnover and with a high competitive impact. Companies of a low turnover that would not be caught by our turnover thresholds. The buzzword is killer acquisitions. There's a worldwide debate how to best make use of our jurisdiction and how to get in these mergers for scrutiny. Also with regard to legal certainty and predictability. Personally, I have always emphasized the need for clear and predictable rules on jurisdiction. The European Court of Justice has just stressed this principle in its ruling on Illumina Gray, and these principles are also emphasized by OECD recommendations and by ICN recommended practices. On a personal note, I do believe that to catch killer acquisitions, one very good way forward by clear and predictable criteria is the transaction value threshold. Our own transaction value threshold here in Germany of roughly 400 million euros, introduced in 2017, allowed us to look into relevant mergers with a lot of legal certainty. We have referred some problematic cases to the European Commission that were notifiable in Germany under the transaction value threshold, like Booking, eTravelI, and Adobe Figma. So the debate about killer acquisitions and how to get them in under scrutiny of an agency is not finished. We will continue to discuss it fiercely, I guess, at the OECD and in the ICN. The GCCA is also authorized to protect consumer rights. That is a great complement to competition enforcement. Unfortunately, my agency, the Bundeskartellamt, has only very limited powers in this regard, and we would have welcomed more enforcement powers with regard to consumer protection. In Germany, consumer protection is primarily enforced under civil law. There are very few authorities in Germany which really take care of consumer protection, but there are large parts of the economy where no agency is really in charge and responsible. So the system of civil law enforcement generally works, but of course there are enforcement gaps. Often consumers do not know their rights very well. Often consumers do not know how to enforce their rights. And very often the main problem is, when it comes to civil enforcement, that the facts need to be proven, but consumers have no investigative powers. Investigative powers are only left to state authorities. And this is why I think it is very important that you also have an agency that, in a complement to civil enforcement, takes care of consumer protection. In view of this, I'm very happy that this conference also deals with consumer protection among many other hot topics, such as digital and regulated markets, and of course, cartel enforcement, the core of our legitimacy as competition agencies. I wish you a wonderful conference. I wish you great debates on all these interesting topics. Thank you very much.
Ქალბატონებო და ბატონებო, კიდევ ერთხელ ძალიან დიდი მადლობა ჩვენს მომხსენებლებს. დიდი მადლობა ესეთ საინტერესო თემების გაჟღერებისათვის. ახლა კი შეგვიძლია შევისვენოთ გარეთა სივრცეში. ამ სივრცეში დღევანდელი ჩვენი შეხვედრა ამოიწურა. თუმცა 3:15 დააკლდება უკვე იწყება პანელური დისკუსიები, პარალელური პანელური დისკუსიები და თქვენი ინტერესების გათვალისწინებით შეგიძლიათ დაესწროთ. აქვე მინდა გავაჟღერო ინფორმაცია, როგორც შენიშნეთ, შემოსასვლელში განთავსებული არის QR კოდები, რომლის დასკანერების შემთხვევაში ხელი მიგიწვდებათ დღევანდელი ღონისძიების ფოტოსურათებზე. მადლობა. და მოგიწოდებთ მაქსიმალური ჩართულობისაკენ ძალიან საინტერესო პანელური დისკუსიები გველის წინ. მადლობა.